to the Atheist and Christian Book Club. We are a monthly get together of both believers and skeptics, respectfully discussing important books from both perspectives. We usually alternate books, atheist book one month and a Christian book the next month. My name is James Walker. I'm president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical Christian apologetics ministry focusing primarily on interfaith evangelism. And I'm co-host of this group along with Bill Cluck. Bill Cluck is the former Christian, now atheist, and we've been doing the book club now for about 5 years, mostly on Zoom in recent years. So we have usually the author with us, either in person here in Texas or by Zoom, and we have our author with us by Zoom this time. Our author is Luke Barnes, and let me take a moment to introduce Luke. He is a British actor and playwright, probably best known for his role as Rast in Game of Thrones. Oh, wait a minute, that's the wrong Luke Barnes.
I'm friends with
our
Luke Barnes.
Our Luke Barnes is a theoretical astrophysicist and cosmologist, and postdoctoral researcher at Western Sydney University. He received his PhD in astronomy from the University of Cambridge in 2009. He's a John Templeton Fellow and has published papers in the field of galaxy formation. Now, some of these may have to be rewritten after the James Webb Telescope. We might talk about that later. But galaxy formation and fine-tuning of the universe for life. And that's the topic we're going to talk about today, because he's also the author, along with Grant Lewis, of A Fortunate Universe, Life in a Finely Tuned Cosmos, published by Cambridge University Press. Luke, welcome to the Atheist and Christian Book Club.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to have some questions for you in just a moment, but I wanted to start off with maybe a question or two from our co-founder, and for the rest of us, if you've got questions, if you'll go ahead and put it in the text, and either Daniel Ray or Brady Blevins, they'll be moderating that, and then they will invite you to come on, unmute your microphone, and we want to give everybody who would like to a chance to ask questions of Dr. Barnes. And so, Bill, do you want to what did you think of the book, and do you have some questions for Dr. Barnes?
Fantastic book, and thanks a lot, Luke, for joining us. I mean, I've really enjoyed your videos, especially the video "Unbelievable" with Justin Briley, where you spoke with Sabina. So her point was that we have these constants and parameters that do seem to be very fine-tuned. Your co-author said the same thing, that it's just amazing precision of these things, like the gravitational constant, the strong nuclear force, and so forth. But it just seems that you could say these things just are, that it's just a brute fact. So, Luke, why do we need to drag God into this thing?
Well, straight into the deep end with the questions here.
That's Bill.
The weather's fine today. Thanks for asking. Yeah, wonderful. So
it gets worse.
Always,
sorry.
As always, no, this is great. As always, the question's what's the best explanation? So look, we'll keep things just are as they are, and that's all there is to it, as a live option in our set of explanations. One of the reasons we don't go for that in everyday life, if the ice creams are missing out of the freezer and I want to know where they've gone, the reason we don't just accept the, that's just the way the universe is today, explanation is we can spot, one of the reasons for that is we can spot a better explanation that we can compare with that explanation and see whether we can do better. So the question is, where are we going to stop our search for explanations in the universe? We see, the whole point of the reason the scientific enterprise exists is that actually when we try and look under the hood of nature, so to speak, we find there are laws and patterns that suggest something deeper under the surface. So I'm at the moment lecturing thermodynamics to my students here at Western Sydney University, and there's all sorts of weird and seemingly disconnected phenomena that have to do with heat and compression and all those sorts of things. But with a bit of, incredible genius from some people in the 18th and 19th century, we worked out the laws of thermodynamics that boil all of that down to basic principles. And then beyond that, you've got people at the end of the 19th century trying to explain all of that in terms of atoms and how they react and all that sort of stuff. So the point is, okay, when science has done all of its, all that it could possibly be imagined to do, and we find ourselves staring at the ultimate laws of nature, assuming that they exist, it's hard to imagine how we could assure ourselves that these were actually the ultimate laws of nature. But ignore that for a second. Suppose we are in fact looking at the ultimate laws of nature. Do we think that we're done? I mean, do we think that that's all the explanation we ever wanted for existence and reality and being and all the laws and the stuff and everything? Or do we think that there might be more explanation to be had? And again, that's a question of, do I think I can glimpse a deeper level of explanation which would explain why things are the way that they are? So brute force is on the table. It's a question of whether we can do better.
Okay. But as lay people, we have a difficult time. Like, for instance, I love your stuff on dark matter. We infer that because of gravitational lensing, galactic rotational curves, and of course the cluster galaxy's velocity. So we don't see it. It doesn't react to electromagnetism, so light doesn't respond to it, but we believe it's there, correct?
Yes. Well, in that there's, the universe is a big, complicated place, and we try to understand it with the basic properties that we think are there, including dark matter. But there are some observations. Actually, Geraint knows this. My co-author knows this even better than I do. He's sort of unearthed one of these. If you look at the way that smaller galaxies swarm around larger galaxies, you get some sort of interesting and weird properties that you might not have expected if dark matter is the only thing going on in terms of matter that we can't see. So one of the things Geraint showed was around our nearest neighbor galaxy called Andromeda. The galaxy swarming around it, the smaller galaxy swarming around the bigger galaxy, don't appear to be at random. They appear to be in some preferential plane of the sky. So there's they all line up in a way that seems a bit unusual. Now, is that just a sort of weird local fluke, or is that pointing us to some deeper physics? This is what we're trying to work out.
All right, and dark energy is what drives the expansion of the universe. Is that correct?
It's not what initially started the expansion of the universe, but today, it's really the change in the expansion of the universe that's driven by whatever the dominant form of energy is. So not whether it's expanding or not, but whether it's accelerating or decelerating. Right. So at the moment, it's dark energy, which is controlling the expansion. And the nature of dark energy is that when it's in charge, the expansion accelerates. And
you've said that one of the best constants to imply God would be, you have the gravitational constant 10 to the 60th, the strong nuclear force that combined holds the protons and neutrons, which is amazing stuff, because you said if we didn't have this force, then you would just have helium all over the place. So you've given it the cosmological constant, as has other people, of 10 to the 120th. That's just sheer amazing. These numbers are just astronomical, right? So, as skeptics, we want to look at the evidence fairly. And when we see these numbers, how can we be sure that they're correct? Well, the cosmological constant 10 to the 120th.
Well, it depends what you mean by correct. So you're in what's commonly known as the layman's dilemma, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So a friend of mine summarized it as follows: there are people with PhDs in geology who are young Earth creationists, That was his summary of the layman's dilemma. There are people who know way more than you about the age of the Earth who think it's 6,000 years old. That's just a fact. You just got to deal with it. So how can we know? Well, the argument is at least reasonably simple. It might be me as an astrophysicist sort of overselling it a bit, but the idea of the cosmological constant problem is it's a very long-standing problem in physics. So there's a famous article on it by Stephen Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in particle physics. The article's from the late 80s, and it's still very highly cited and highly regarded. It hasn't all been overturned. So at least as a layperson, that's a reasonable sign. The argument is simply, look, well, there are some very basic equations that tell us how the expansion of the universe, and in particular, as I was saying, the change in the expansion of the universe, how it depends on the contents of the universe, what the universe is made out of. Those equations were first derived in the 1920s, and they're still doing absolutely fine. All they assume is Einstein's understanding of gravity and just some very simple assumptions about, simplifying assumptions that the universe doesn't change from position to position and in different directions. These are the Friedmann equations. And in those equations, if you can then straightforwardly say, if the universe was made of this or that, how would it expand? And then from within particle physics, there's no reason to expect the stuff of the universe. There's sort of a range of possibilities that the stuff of the universe could have in terms of energies. And if you take those forms of energy and you put them into these equations and ask what happens, you quite straightforwardly blow the universe to pieces, and nothing ever touches on anything else. Anything else, no two protons stick together. So the steps in it, look, this isn't mathematics. We don't prove things around here in science, but the steps are so straightforward that you have, there's a textbook called A Primer on the Standard Model about particle physics. Burgess, quite well known it's about a decade old now at least. But when it comes to say, look, here's this textbook has summarized everything we know about the stuff the universe is made of. What are the major problems left to solve? And the cosmological constant is just number one in that list, in that particular textbook. So, I mean, that seems fairly safe ground to me, to at least have not like the textbook doesn't end, therefore God, go to church. But at least the science of what would happen if this number were different, if that's going to lead us towards, okay, what is there anything remarkable about this universe? We're at least on fairly safe, for the moment, scientific grounds.
Okay. The other thing that was amazing was the resonance of carbon, that you have two helium atoms that combine with what would deuterium or whatever.
3 helium nuclei.
3 helium nuclei, but it combines with beryllium. That was it. That has a life expectancy of 10 to the minus 16th.
Yeah.
I mean, and it only happens 1 out of 2,500 times. Is that correct? That it disappears.
That's going to be temperature dependent, but yeah.
Okay. So just to get carbon off the ground seems like a miracle. But if we were in a silicon-based universe, would we be saying, "Oh my gosh, silicon is just amazing"? Because carbon is an amazing, element that is the basis of life. So would we be saying the same thing if we were in a silicon-based universe?
Well, yeah, I think we would, and I don't think that's any sort of problem for the argument. Any universe capable of supporting life has a very rare collection of conditions. It doesn't have to be unique. Okay. One of the things I think we'd be saying, if we were silicon-based life forms, and we'd reached not just sentience but sort of scientific discovery of the world around us, and we'd mapped out the periodic table, and we'd started to ask the question, what sort of chemical compounds can we make? And we made an enormous database of all the chemical compounds we'd ever been able to create. We would start noticing that most of them have got this carbon stuff in it. Why are we made of silicon? This carbon stuff is way more versatile. That would be an interesting question. I don't think it would just derail their fine-tuning argument. I think that would work just fine over there as well, given that the expectation, if you just pick a universe at random, you don't get any life forms at all, not just silicon-based ones. But so that, they would notice that they were sort of obviously made out of something slightly inferior. Perhaps. But I don't think that's any sort of problem for the argument that there might be other possible forms of life out there. It's like, if you opened if there was I keep coming back to this illustration, I'm sorry, but the illustration of, you see someone walk up to a vault in a bank and put in the correct key code to get in the first time. Suppose it needs 12 digits. Right, and you see the CCTV footage of the bank robbery, and the robbers walked straight up to the vault, hit 12 numbers, hit enter, and the vault immediately opened. You would think immediately, sort of intuitively, well, they obviously knew the number. It wouldn't be any sort of major problem for that argument if you discovered that actually there were 2 different codes that could open the vault out of a trillion. It just wouldn't really matter.
Yeah, look, I had a question for you. Always in our book club, there's going to be a percentage of our club members who fail to do their homework at the university. You may have that same issue, so they may not have read what they wanted to get read. We've dealt with it with fine tuning in other, past book clubs a little bit as well. But you had a kind of a good illustration at the front of the book about where you compared baking a cake and having a recipe. Could you kind of share that with us as backing up just a little bit and say, in a nutshell, what is fine tuning? What is life? Why is it so remarkably difficult to have occurred randomly? The parameters all being in place. Could you share that with us?
So the analogy is fairly simple. It actually sort of underscores the stuff I was just saying, that if you want to make a cake, suppose you've got all the possible ingredients in your kitchen, or some sort of set of, you've got this sort of flour, that sort of flour, and sugar and all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of different ways to make cake, right? There's different amounts of eggs you could put in. You could use self-raising flour, or you could use flour. You could use various amounts of, baking soda or baking powder or whatever. However, if you just walked into the kitchen and picked a random amount of each ingredient, threw it in a bowl, mixed it together, and then threw it in the oven for a while, almost certainly you wouldn't want to eat the thing that came out the other side of that. So, in that sense, a cake recipe is fine-tuned. Not even in the sense that some person has carefully chosen the ingredients, but just that with a certain outcome in mind, right? Something edible. The input you've got to put in there needs to be, needs to be constrained in some way, in the sense that, as a random collection of random amounts of random ingredients isn't going to do it for you. Now, so fine-tuning in that sense is an analogy for something we talk about in physics, which is when a certain outcome depends very sensitively on certain input parameters. Again, it doesn't presuppose a fine tuner. It might prove one, but that's not what the meaning of the term is. So that analogy also, that there's more than one way to make a cake doesn't affect that at all, right? If you looked at all the number of ways to not make a cake vastly outnumber the number of ways to make a cake if you're just randomly throwing ingredients together. So in terms of the universe, if we look at the ingredients that we need to put together, the forces and the masses and all of these sorts of things. Ours is not unique, but it is rare in that same sort of sense. Throw together a random collection of electrons and their masses and forces and all that sort of stuff. And what happens next is perfectly predictable. It's just very, very boring. Nothing sticks to anything else, and you don't get life or any sort of complexity.
Luke, I was in, I've told you offline, but a couple of weeks ago, I was in Dallas with an all atheist book club talking about your book. Actually, I recommended the book for the discussion, and then they let me lead the discussion. So I had to do my homework. So a couple of things though that came up and I thought would be great to talk about tonight, as you haven't, so you don't have to answer all this all at once, but it may come up again. One of them was, and I know you got into this with Sabina on Unbelievable. I don't know.
I think Sabina, but yeah.
She was congenial enough to come on, but it seemed like she was like, well, we don't have to explain these numbers. And we talked about it at the beginning, and this came up at our book club, and I thought it was just a fascinating thing. And I made the point, I says, well, so are we getting this idea that we don't have to explain these things from the data? So these free parameters that are out there, they weren't calculated, they weren't predicted. They're there, 24, 25 of them. I don't know how many there are now, but I said, the numbers, whatever these are, whatever the fine structure constant, whatever you want to mention, they're not telling you that they don't need an explanation. So it was almost like, in a sense, they were trying to prohibit an explanation almost, rather than the curiosity about where these numbers came from seemed to betray what Dick Feynman thought about them. You know, his whole put the fine structure constant up on your wall and worry about it did not seem to permeate the minds of the people that were there at the group. And so I made the suggestion, and it kind of delved into chatter, but this idea that we don't need to explain these numbers is not finally coming from the numbers themselves, right? This is where we get into the metaphysics of fine tuning and what it may or may not mean. Does that make sense? Do you get that a lot?
Yeah. So I mean, the question of, again, it's a very broad question. When are you happy to stop your explanation and say, all right, we're all done now? Yeah. And I would suggest that when you're faced with a huge number of ways that reality could have turned out, with no way of choosing between them, but and according to your theory, according to whatever theory you're putting out there, no way of preferring one way to another, that at least you should look into, maybe there's a deeper reason going on behind the scenes here. I'll come back to the bank vault analogy. So if you think the robber turns up, you see the CCTV footage, they just walk straight up to the vault and put in a code that opens the door, right, and take all the money. If you think that that's just a brute fact, that he just walked up and just whatever number was in the robber's head, that's the one that they punched in and they just got lucky, that it just is, you're faced with that. There's a huge number of possibilities of what could have happened, of all the numbers that they could have punched in. Suppose it's a 12-digit code. There's a trillion numbers that could have been punched in. If the door works correctly, only one of those actually opens the door. So you've got a huge number of possibilities and a very specific outcome. That's a condition in which you would want to at least look further to try to understand whether something else is going on here. Right. It's a condition in which some other idea has the opportunity to swoop in and explain what's really going on. Now, sometimes it's not just that there's lots of possibilities. That's not enough, right? If I take a deck of cards, I've got one over there. If you thoroughly shuffle a deck of cards, really properly shuffle it for ages, right, and then lay out the exact order that those cards appeared in, just purely by the mathematics, almost certainly no deck of cards has ever been in that order in the history of the world, or ever will be ever again. The numbers are just absolutely enormous. So there's 52 options for what the first card could be, and then 51 for the next, and 50 for the next, and 49 for the next. So it's 52 factorial. I don't know, stick it into it's some enormous number. Hang on, maybe Google can actually calculate it for me. It's 6 times 10 to the 67. So it's a number with 68 digits in it, right? There's just, it's just some enormous number. So the fact that there are small, and that's just I'm just shuffling a deck of cards. The fact that small numbers turn up in probabilities doesn't by itself mean anything. What matters is that we can glimpse away that this particular order could be explained. If I pick up that deck of cards over there and I lay them out one after another, and I find that they're in deck order, right? Ace, king, queen of hearts, right? All the way through to the 2 of diamonds. I don't know what the actual deck order is, but imagine it's that. Again, I've got something which is as unlikely if it was shuffled at random to be there as any other deck, but I've now got a possible explanation, right? They're in deck order because someone put them in deck order just because that's the most organized way you can put a deck of cards if you want to find them. Or perhaps they're brand new, they've just come from the factory, they come out in deck order and they've never been shuffled or used. So with these fine-tuning things, it's small probabilities should lead us to think, okay, is there anything here which a deeper probability increasing explanation could get a handle on in order to provide a better explanation for what's going on? So if I shuffle that deck of cards, all afternoon, and then just give them to someone, and then they spread them out and look at the order, there's going to be no obvious way of explaining that particular deck of cards. And so they're not going to take the low probability as some sort of conspiracy theory that this is exactly the deck of cards order that you wanted. So I think the question of when do we stop an explanation, it's when do we think we can glimpse at least a better explanation which might explain what's going on behind the scenes here. So what the argument from fine-tuning to God relies on, what it proposes, is that the fact that the fact that our universe contained the kind of beings who can have morally significant lives is the sort of thing that a creator might want to create, and that might is enough. We don't have to read God's mind and know exactly what God would or wouldn't do. If it's a possibility that's on the table, then we've got at least something in the ballpark that we can go comparing to just pure chance or brute fact or whatever.
Hey, by the way, Luke, it was remarkable. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It was remarkable that your book was chosen by hardcore atheists that have been meeting for 14 years. I think it might be the first time they've had a Christian, and applause for Dan for going into the lion's den here. But he did an excellent job of explaining your book, and most of them were just very receptive. But Luke, I got to be honest with you, they did bring up the G word. Okay. They talked about the Genesis account, and yes, they did talk about the G word, goat herders. Okay. That it was written by goat herders. I hate to say that because it's one of those atheist memes that, but anyway, let me try to articulate what he said. That you have in Genesis a flawed account. You have the earth on the first day, sun on the fourth day, just the opposite of what science says. You have the plants coming on day 3 way too early. Dinosaurs and man, the first Australopithecine came on the scene 6 million years ago. Dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. In Genesis, it has them on the same day. So my question to you is, like William Lane Craig gives the odds of Christianity being true as 1 in a million. He just said this recently. With this flawed Genesis account, what do you give the odds of Christianity being?
It's a big old question. I'm not familiar with what William Lane Craig said about that.
He just recently said that it was 1 out of a million. He wrote a book, by the way, that in Quest for Historical Adam, where he says what you're looking at in Genesis is mytho-history. It's not real history. And that the first thing that looks like a homo was 750,000 years ago.
Right. So, I mean, the question is, what is Genesis actually trying to teach us? And so so Craig and many, many others, when they say it's mytho-history, it's not failed history. It's not trying to be history, but they didn't know, so they just made some stuff up. It's using a something that reads like an account of events to illustrate deeper principles about the way nature is put together and how we're supposed to look at the world around us. It's providing the point of a myth is not really that you look at it, but that you look from it. It's a perspective. So, for example, when the ancient Babylonians, you can go and read the Enuma Elish myth, and that's a great one. I'd highly recommend that. There's dragons ripping each other apart. It's great fun. I read that out to my to the youth group kids at my church.
Oh,
and
wow.
they loved it. They loved it.
Good
and then we read the Genesis account, and they're like, where are the dragons? The point is, so in that one, there's lead gods and they're bickering amongst each other, and they start fighting, and then they get there's a war and people get betrayed, and then one sort of son of the gods or one of the children of the gods turns out to be way more powerful than all the other ones and wins this thing, and the loser gets ripped in half to make the heavens and the earth. At some point there's the mother and father gods, and then there's all their children, and the father says to the mother god, they're too noisy, let's just kill them all. So real themes of parenting there. And they when one of the gods gets destroyed, they make heaven and earth, but then the gods look at it and go, we don't want to have to look after this place, let's make people who will look after it for us, and there's humankind. Now, if you use that as your perspective on the world around you, it's going to lead you to expect certain things. That fundamentally that the world is chaos and ugliness all the way down, that don't bother going and looking for any sort of patterns behind it, because it's the wreckage of a fight between chaos monsters, or it should be viewed in that way. So don't be surprised when there's various when things seem to go wrong out there in nature. Of course they do. If you take Genesis as a standpoint of, it's a perspective to look from rather than to look at, you end up with a very different picture of the world that emphasizes that beauty and order were there first, and that disorder and chaos are impinging on that, and they're not in their natural place. There is a way the world should be, and this is not it, but there is a perfection behind the scenes. There's order underneath. So you can take, and Christians, theologians do this. There's a wonderful book that came out recently by Chris Wilkins called Biblical Critical Theory, which is just really about how the Bible is that sort of perspective. You can stand from there and look out on the world and have it and have things fall into the place that they're supposed to fall into. So when you look at Genesis, arguing about whether the sun was created in the right day relative to what science thinks it is totally missing the point of what it's trying to do. It's trying to teach you to look for God's perfect plan underneath it, to accept that something has gone wrong, and to look forward to the redemption of that in the future. So I think that's my view on this. Obviously, lots of people think different things about Genesis, but it's not failed science because it's not trying to be science. I can't fail at a competition I haven't entered, right? I can't come last in a race I'm not running in. Genesis is not trying to do that. That's my particular perspective on these things. I know lots of people think other things. In particular, I don't try to mold some interpretation of Genesis onto science. That's something that Hugh Ross tries to do. I don't think that's a useful approach at all. I don't think that's what it's trying to do. It's giving you a perspective on and a memorable version of sort of theological truth about God and his relationship to the world and what the world is really like. To notice that if something seems out of place, it's because there really is a way the world should be.
Now, would you describe yourself as old Earth creationist, progressive creationist?
Certainly, well, depends how you define those terms is the problem.
You want to put millions of years into those days.
No, I absolutely don't. No, no.
Okay.
Because it's not failed history. I'm not trying to resurrect it as history and as science, right? I'm not trying to save it from that. It's not trying to be that at all in the first place. So no, I'm not trying to put millions of years.
Well, that's
Genesis.
what Hugh Ross does. He does exegetical gymnastics where he says, oh, wait, the sun really was created on the first day. The reason it appeared the atmosphere was translucent, it became transparent on the fourth day. And the people, the voters just got it wrong, but they didn't know what they were talking, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's not what I'm trying. I know. By old Earth creationism, you mean that Genesis was really trying to tell us what's in the textbook? That's not what I think.
Okay.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, some comments. I think Brady, we want to go with who was first, Brady? You saw
Ken. I think Ken had one on there first.
Okay. So
I know there were some other comments, but Ken, I think Ken was one who actually had the first question on there.
Yeah. Ken, open up the mic and fire away.
All right. Well, this is a real privilege to have you on with us. I do appreciate the approach that you took in the book with your co-author, and hopefully I'm not going to pronounce it wrong. I'm not familiar with the name. Geraint, is it Geraint?
Well, if you're Welsh, you sort of roll the R a little bit, and the AI sort of sounds a bit more like an I. It's I don't know. Geraint. Just Geraint. He's used to Australians pronouncing it Geraint. So
Geraint.
Yeah, well, I really do appreciate the approach you took, working on the book together and coming up with at least until the end, you were telling a consistent story that you agreed on the fact that fine tuning is a real thing that has to be explained. And I just wonder, how could you tell us a little bit about the background to how this project started? How did you meet him, and what kind of relationship have you had outside of this project? And also, what is your perspective on if he were to perish today, as an unbeliever, what would your view of his eternal fate be, or if any?
Wow. So I was literally talking to Geraint via a Zoom chat on what was that, Wednesday, and we were just talking about the fact that people. This is one of the main sort of novelties of the book, that a Christian and an atheist read it, and it's not what we weren't thinking of that at all. We just hear some interesting science, let's tell the story, and then we disagree about the ending, so we'll just write we almost wrote two separate chapters at the end, and then Geraint thought, no, let's weave it in together into one conversation. He was my honors supervisor back in 2005 when I was finishing my undergraduate degree at Sydney University. He was instrumental in me getting a scholarship to go to Cambridge, which is where he did his PhD as well. My PhD supervisor was one of his old classmates. I did a postdoc with him in Sydney back in 2011, and then he was helpful in me getting another grant to do a postdoc with him. And it was during that one actually that we sort of had the idea for the book already, and then wrote the book together. He'd been thinking of writing a book on something in science because he enjoys writing. I presented a talk about this particular topic, fine tuning, and then he was like, "Oh, let's just do that. Let's write a book together about this topic," because he could see it was something that was of immense interest, at least to sciencey type people, if not to the general public. It was something that he knew a bit about and I knew a lot about, and he was keen to write a book, so it sort of all came together. So yeah, it was quite straightforward. We just sort of wrote, as I've said previously, there's one footnote where we disagree with each other, which people can go and find. And then the conversation at the end didn't quite happen as a conversation like that. We sort of wrote our bits and then back and forward and around and around. But it's been quite useful for me, the way. So he keeps getting asked, we say, the last chapter of the book is a debate between us. And we've sort of noticed that both of our sides, so to speak, one of the first questions is, why didn't you win? So the atheist asks him, why didn't you win the debate? And I get asked, why didn't you win the debate? And well, we just wanted to sort of leave it as it is, let people make up their own minds. So as I said, I was chatting to him on Wednesday. We've got another grant coming up. We're going to try and do some more of the simulations on fine tuning. It's funny because we think of the UK as being more religious, and he was raised in Wales, which is particularly religious. But as far as I can tell, he didn't have any sort of religious upbringing. His parents weren't. He didn't go to church or anything like that. And so this interaction with theological types is sort of something that's sort of happened quite late in his life. And he mentioned the other day he was writing something for some theologian. I don't know. I had to follow. It was in the middle of a conversation. I'm going to follow him up on that recently. But certainly, I heard someone ask him what the attraction of all this fine tuning stuff was, and he said something along the lines of, maybe this naturalism isn't all I thought it was cut out to be. But that's, So yeah, he's my friend. It's a short story. We chat about everything. So we wrote another book just behind me as well after that one, and we've got plans to write more, and a bit harder to do. But
well, I thought you did a great job of answering or raising questions or common objections to the idea that fine tuning is a problem, and you really checked up all the boxes that I had heard. And so basically I have to, as a non-believer myself, I'm not an atheist, but I call myself more of an agnostic. I found those Q&As or those responses to objections very compelling. So it kind of forces you into this box where you got to either choose, well, is it a divine being, or is it some sort of multiverse, or is it just brute fact? So, and the Boltzmann brain problem does seem to raise some interesting questions in my mind. I'm not sure how I'm not real familiar with the whole concept, but it sounds like an interesting problem that could be a challenge to my position. An even deeper problem is like, well, if there's a multiverse, how do you get that universe generating mechanism off the ground to begin with, and not to mention the whole infinite regress problem. So those are other issues that weren't dealt with as much, and so I find them equally, if not even more challenging. But on the other hand, so you might wonder, okay, well, why would I even gravitate towards non-belief if I find those to be challenging? So it seems like every check on the left-hand side of the ledger for God or for a divine being has something else on the other side of the ledger. And one of the sticking points for me is like, if I imagine that a God or a divine being is capable to pull all the levers, and as you would say, maybe in Britain or Australia, levers, pull all those levers to get the universe off the ground, to have that kind of power and wisdom and insight and wizardry. It seems like any God capable of doing that would be capable of creating the universe as we currently know it, without the whole prologue of 13.8 billion years, including the last few 100 million years of animal sentience and suffering due to predation and disease and fire and famine and cold and what you name it, all kinds of suffering. It seems like all of that would have been pointless and unnecessary if a God capable of doing all that fine tuning could have just said, hey, I'm just going to create the world as it is and dispense with all that apparently pointless suffering along the way. Do you have a response to that, or what is your theological position with regard to that?
So there's a couple of things to say there. The first is that it's no part of the argument that human beings are the only purpose of the universe.
Mhm.
So it's no part of it that this is all here for us, that this is all, here serving us. In fact, I don't think the Bible has that view either. So you have parts of the Bible where, the point of the heavens is not that they look pretty for us. It's for God just enjoying demonstrating his own power. I'm thinking of Psalm 8 here and a few others. So if there's parts of the universe that came before us that are so far away we can barely see them, where we couldn't survive, all those sorts of things, I think that affects only the assumption that the universe is only here for humankind, and that's no part of the argument, and it's no part of Christianity either. So I don't know who that's supposed to be aimed at. The problem of suffering's obviously sort of a massive issue. In the context of this argument, we at least have the perspective that, okay, if you just pick a universe at random, yes, it doesn't have any suffering in it. That's because it doesn't have any sentience in it at all. Nothing suffers because nothing lives. So it's not, again, it's all about comparing hypotheses, not about trying to judge them on just their own in isolation. So what's the best explanation we have for why we live in a world which contains hummingbirds and wasps? Like, why not just make hummingbirds? Why make wasps? To put it, a little bit too tritely, I suppose. What's the best explanation? Is it just sort of random and whatever stuff came out? Well, if you start a universe off with it's random and whatever comes out, you don't get life at all. Almost certainly. That's the lesson of fine tuning. So I think we're trying to look for the kind of argument which might do a bit better than that. So could I possibly believe that under the appearances, as I think Augustine said, God saw that it was better to allow evil and suffering for a time than to not allow evil and suffering at all. That there is some way that the story in the future is going to be wrapped together, which will make it an understandable but small and temporary part of the total story. And I think that's the sort of Christian approach to that. The answer is in the future. If there's a God bringing about nature towards God's own ends, and we're a very small and temporary part of that, then we won't understand all of it. In terms of animal suffering, that's a particularly hard one because, what are they getting out of all this? But that in the end is a question. And if I don't know the answer to that, then it's just a question I don't know the answer to. And I'm going to have to live with those, whatever else happens. It's trying to find the way of putting the world together, which minimizes those questions. And if I just throw God out of the picture, then I have the questions I get are sort of infinitely larger, like why is there a universe at all, and why does it permit life, and why does it run according to laws at all? And I just get much larger, seemingly much more intractable questions. But it's not that I have zero questions. I just think I've minimized them to some extent.
Oh, by the way, Luke, what's with the overkill here of the universe? There's 100 billion and 200 billion. What is it? 300 billion galaxies?
Not sure.
Well, with
I'll count them.
100 billion stars in each one. I mean, they compare it to there's as many suns as there are grains of sand in all the beaches of the world. Have you heard that illustration?
I'm not sure if that's true.
Okay.
I think there's more sand. Anyway, carry on.
Okay. But anyway, there's a lot of galaxies, lots of stars, just unbelievable. Why the overkill? God didn't have to make all those. Why not just do the Milky Way?
Well, again, that's assuming that we're the only purpose of God's creation.
Okay.
But if he's just making us a little rabbit hutch for us, then all we need, is just 3 feet of chicken wire and a little water bottle and some hay, and that'll do us, right? But if God has other ideas, so you got to think about so for example, I think that God has made a world in which parts of the world point sort of in the direction of God. So C.S. Lewis has this wonderful distinction between looking at versus looking along. So if you look at a sign, a sort of a road sign that points in a certain direction, you can look at the sign, but what you're supposed to do is look along the sign and go that way. And so what Lewis says is, you know, the almost infinity, the sort of bigger than we can even imagine-ness of the universe, if we look along it, if you look at it, then you get Pascal's The Terror of Infinite Space. But if you look along it, you might just get a glimpse of an infinite God. And so, you know, if this world is a testament to him, not to us, then having it being, you know, enormous and majestic and more powerful and infinite than we can imagine fits. But again,
Bill, I like to use.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Finish up. No, I use the analogy. I think you were there at the book club. I think I used this analogy with the other guys. The Burj Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. Part of that glory is that you can go there, but that tower wasn't built for you. The tower was built for the glory of Dubai. So you know, people might say, well, why did they build such elaborate, ornate? You could just live in a hut like so many people do in the Middle East. But that's be a Bedouin, just crawl into a cave if you're going to just need shelter. This seems to be overkill in terms of sheltering people, but it's not about finally the guests. That's part of it, but it is about the glory of the United Arab Emirates. And they're all about that. Look at my wealth.
That's a good illustration, Dan.
And I think that's Colossians 1:16 is the verse that I'm coming to mind, that everything was created through him and for him. And so what you're looking at in the vastness is what David says in Psalm 8, Psalm 19, the heavens are declaring the glory of God. The skies proclaim his handiwork. Day and today pours forth speech. Night unto night reveals knowledge. And that's the thing. Luke, I was wondering if you can address, and this is fascinating to me because I think I got it right, but I would love to have you talk about a little bit more the hierarchy problem that was brought about by the discovery of the Higgs boson, or the confirmation of Higgs-like boson behavior a couple of years ago. What is this hierarchy problem in physics, and why is this parameter? Why is this one big question that's buzzing around? And I think I understood it, but I want to hear you do it to make sure. I'm going to take notes here to see if I got this right. I think I explained it right, but what is the hierarchy problem in relation to the Higgs?
Just jumping back, yeah, it turns out there are more stars than grains of sand. So yeah, that just to fill that in, I didn't know that. That's good. It's because I don't know grains of sand. So the hierarchy problem is roughly as follows. You're often interested in physics with what sets overall scales, right? So you could do a very detailed calculation about, you know, modeling exactly how a star works and all those, you know, and all the processes and the way energy moves around and all of that. What you would like at the end of that is not just all the little details, but some idea about why are they that big. So if you write down how many particles are there in a star, your answer has about 57 digits in it. And it turns out nature cares that it's 57. And if you had 56 or 58, you get a very different, they run quite differently across that range. And 55, they don't exist. And 59, they don't exist. You can't be too small or too large and be a star. You got to be in the right range. So what is it that sets that overall kind of scale? So as we look then to particles, fundamental particles, the total opposite end of the scale, we have the fundamental pieces that we're made out of, the electron and the proton and the neutron are themselves made up of smaller particles called quarks. And the question is, okay, one of the fundamental properties, one of the very few fundamental properties they actually have is a mass that, you know, you could imagine at least putting them on a set of scales and working out how much they weigh. And it, obviously in something like kilograms, it would be very small, but there is a number that we can measure, which is the mass of the electron. Why does it have that mass? Well, in the standard model, properly fundamental particles get their mass by interacting with what's called the Higgs field. So more or less, mass is about how much force do I need to push something to give it a certain acceleration, right? As well as being a gravitational mass. But think of that first one. Let's call it inertial mass. How much I got to push it. So the picture is kind of, this is almost close. You have a particle, and when I try and push it, it's interacting with the Higgs field that you're pushing it through, which is a bit like a swamp that you then have to push it through. Now that doesn't quite work because swamps have, it'll be water, air resistance and fluid resistance. It's not quite the right physics, but that picture kind of works. So the scale then that you would expect, the sort of rough scale, is the amount of mass that there is available in the Higgs field itself. So the Higgs particle has a certain mass that sets roughly the amount of mass that's there. That's the scale of mass in the problem.
So we're talking about a perimeter of we're talking about the size of a swamp. We would expect the swamp to be this big. And that's kind of what you're saying. And I know the swamp thing is not is that
this thick, I guess. This is the problem. The actual thing would be viscosity, but that's actually the wrong physics. So let's just, I'm hand waving around here. Don't take it too literally. If you try and push something through the swamp, there's a certain amount of effort it would take.
Mm-hmm.
The analogy for that is if things get their mass from the Higgs field, if the mass of an electron is really, how strongly is the Higgs field around it trying to hold it as you try and push it around, right? Then there's a typical scale you would expect for the number we get. The hierarchy problem is that scale itself, the scale of the Higgs field, which sets the sort of typical energy levels of particles, is very much smaller than the energy, remember E equals mc squared, energy and mass are sort of the same thing. The energy you would typically expect to be around in a quantum field. There's just in the same way that the cosmological constant could be extremely large, and we might expect it to be extremely large, to be close to where it, could be, you would expect this Higgs scale, just naively, without any further physics, it could be anywhere. It could be, there's a range that it could have, all the way up to where our models can handle this amount. So the hierarchy problem is that scale is actually much, much smaller, about 10 to the 17. So almost a billion trillion times smaller than the physics allows. So this number could be anywhere over this range, and yet the number is extremely close to zero on that range. It's like I say, pick a number between 0 and 1, and you pick the number, 1 billionth of a trillionth. It sounded like you were aiming for 0 there, champ. But 0 wouldn't be any good either. You've got to actually nail a very light, small, right? You didn't just pick a half or a third or, a quarter or something, a billionth of a trillionth. It seems like something's gone wrong. The hierarchy problem is that typical scale of the matter we're made out of is so much lighter than it could have been, given the physics of that underlie these masses and these particles and how they interact with each other.
Is it because I know when they found evidence of the Higgs a couple of years ago, they predicted what the mass of the boson would be, and they were pretty close. So we're not talking about the expected mass of the boson. We're talking about the energy of the field of the Higgs is much smaller. Is that
those two are related. So there's a difference between, can I use the evidence I have to predict what this number is in our universe?
Oh, okay.
Versus if I were just picking a universe off the menu without looking at nature, what would I expect?
Right, I get it. Yeah, I get it. So I almost got it right. That's where I missed it, I think. Well, of course I missed. I'm not a physicist.
It's a tricky concept to
it
take
is a
on.
tricky one, but once you did, I was so fascinated by what I think I was understanding that it was just so compelling. But briefly too, and I think you mentioned this in the book and it came up, what it means, what the term, this was fascinating to me, what the term free parameter means in relation to these constants and quantities that have been uncovered by modern physics in the last century, that these numbers, it seems, Luke, weren't predicted or cannot be calculated based on the sum total of our knowledge of these numbers. We don't know how they fit together. What does it mean when you're talking about free parameters? These things just seem to be there. Is that kind of what they are?
Yeah, so free parameters, if you're fitting any kind of model in physics or science or in general, you have some data, you change this aspect of your setup and you notice how that changes. You water your plants a bit more or a bit less and you see how fast they grow. Whatever it is you're plotting out, if the model might be that there's some linear relationship, say it's a straight line, and then the free parameter is just the free parameters are the free parameters of a straight line. What is the slope? Is it steep or is it shallow? And where does it cross the axis? Is it up or is it down? So for more complicated models, you'll just have these free parameters. It's often the case in physics that we start with, especially in fundamental in particle physics, we start with some sort of symmetry principle, which leads us towards a certain equation. But that symmetry principle tells us about the form of the equation, but leaves a free parameter out the front. So, for example, if I told you I've got some object here off screen, I think I have one handy, and I tell you there's a very strong symmetry with this particular object in that no matter which way I look at it, it looks exactly the same. There's absolutely no difference. Yes, it must be a sphere, right? Mm-hmm. That's such a strong symmetry, such a strong principle. There's no other option there. What I haven't told you and what you can't infer from that is the size of the sphere. It could be small, it could be enormous. That's a free parameter in the model. So analogously, we start with much more abstract principles of symmetry. There's some very weird ideas going around because they're written in a mathematical language that we don't normally speak. But in the same way, this principle lets us arrive at, this symmetry principle lets us arrive at a form that the equation could take. But there's often just a number out the front, like the size of the sphere, which we can't constrain. So there's various principles that tell us the form that the equation that governs how electrons interact with photons. So that's the electromagnetic force. There's a principle called a gauge principle, which is a really, really weird idea that I still don't think I know how to explain or even understand. But you apply this principle, like, this whatever this object is, it's the same in all directions, and you arrive at a form of the equation, but there's a number out the front, which is basically the charge on the electron is what you're measuring there, what turns up in the equation. The symmetry has given us the shape of the equation. Now, it's not a mathematical proof. It's just an idea. We have to go and test it, but we test it and it works. But there's always this number out the front that no deeper principle is telling us why it has to be that way.
So the numbers are, the free parameter is a number we use, number we've measured, but a number we can't, it's there and it's useful, but why it's there, it's just, it's just something we plug into the equation. It's there like toenail fungus. It's there. We got to deal with it. Don't know where it came from. Don't know how to get rid of it. Don't know how to calculate it out of the sky. And this seems to be what for more or less what kept Dick Feynman up all night, like where these numbers come from. I love his quote where he talks about it in the QED book that he had, that God used his finger to push his pencil, and we don't know why he did it. It's interesting that I know he wasn't a theist, but it's interesting that the fine structure constant bothered him so much that he had squeezed out of him this metaphor for God, that God is pushing his pencil in relation to the fine structure constant. So that was funny. Do we have any more questions, Brady? I know I'm hogging up time here. I love talking to Luke.
I
What do we
think
got?
Phil had several comments that I saw in the text. Did we?
Phil, do you want to jump in, Phil? Where did he go? Is he still here? Yeah, there he is. Chime in, Phil.
Unmute.
Hi, everybody.
Hello there.
Hey.
Hello there.
Hi, Luke. Welcome.
Oh,
Actually, my comments were kind of like just to put out there and let them sit, and possibly rot, But, but I had a couple comments about the Genesis account. But the problem with spending too much time on that is that Genesis is kind of a bunny trail to this discussion in a way. So I wouldn't want to spend too much time on it, but I did want to comment about the idea of the flawed Genesis account, because I consider that problematic for several reasons. First of all, it begs the question in favor of naturalism. And secondly, if Jones told me that the Genesis account was flawed, that assumes that Jones knows what the correct account is and that his account is not flawed. And therefore, he's comparing his account that's not flawed to the account of Genesis that he considers flawed. And my question would be, how does Jones know that his account is not flawed? And then in addition, Jones is telling me that his account is the way that it would have to be if modern science was valid and if the principles of modern science were true. And the problem with that is that the first chapter of Genesis is based on the fundamental proposition that God created the heavens and the earth, that he exists and that he created everything. If that's the case, then you're dealing with a supernatural event by definition. If that's the case, then the principles of modern science really don't have anything to do with whether or not those events could have occurred in the order that they've occurred and so on. And my final idea that I wanted to make was that that Genesis is not supposed to be science. So you can't say Genesis has failed science, because you can't fail at something that you never intended to accomplish in the first place. Genesis is a book of history. Genesis is saying such and such happened on such and such a day, and these such and such a days happen in such and such an order. And if we look at that from a modern science perspective, we could say, well, it's unlikely that it would happen in that order. But again, we're dealing with a supernatural event and a supernatural week, a supernatural process, a supernatural period of time where God is doing things with his supernatural power, if he exists and if it's all true. So if that's the case, I don't know that we can subject Genesis to the rigors of science, because it's just not an area where science can actually have any kind of influence, or authority, So, but what I really wanted to talk about, and Luke, I'm going to have to apologize because I haven't had a chance to read your book yet. So you may have covered my question in your book, and if you have, then I apologize because I'm bringing up something that might be redundant, But when I think of the fine-tuning concept and the fine-tuning argument and the whole fine-tuning narrative, I don't hear very many people talking about the fine-tuning of human beings in their ability to observe and comprehend the nature of the external world. Because we seem to be fine-tuned to be able to observe our external world, to be able to interact with other beings. And we seem to be fine-tuned to be able to think in rational terms. And that, to me, that's even more compelling than the idea that nature is fine-tuned, the universe is fine-tuned, that, that the cosmos and gravity and natural law is fine-tuned, and allows for human life and so on. But it seems like we're fine-tuned just to be able to think in the first place. And it seems to me that if the fact that we can think means that there must be something that has created us and designed us to think, because as C.S. Lewis said, if God doesn't exist, then your mind was not designed to think. And so therefore you have no reason to believe that your thinking is valid or can lead you to anything that's true or false or even meaningful. So So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
So very quickly, there's a bunch of different stuff there. So I think in Genesis, one of the problems with saying this is all supernatural and we can't, science shouldn't have anything to say about it if it's a historical account, is it is trying to lay down the fact that the universe is orderly. So it's not just God doing whatever God wants to do. It's God laying out the pattern by which his nature will work henceforth. So
Yeah,
for
I agree with
example, it doesn't say, and then God said, let there be plants on the earth. It says, God said, let the earth produce plants. The earth produced the plants, and God is giving the earth the ability to produce plants. We have this, if you have that 6-day, 24-hour creation mindset, you might be imagining God sort of clicking his fingers and then trees pop out of the earth. But that's not even the picture that's there if you take it literally, that's not the picture that's there either. So I think I would extend the Genesis is not failed science because it's not trying to be science. I would extend that to history. Genesis is not failed history because I don't think it's trying to be history either. I think it's teaching a theological point, but that's a massive discussion, and I'm not an expert on it. So that's just my 2 cents as an astrophysicist, right?
Well,
Go
Phil,
find an expert.
Phil, that was kind of addressed to me. Here's the problem. You have just down the road here in Dallas, Texas, Institute for Creation Research. In Luke's part of the world, you have Answers in Genesis, where it started. These people believe Genesis is scientifically accurate and does make scientific statements. So this is the problem, is that Genesis gets just about everything wrong. When you listen to creationists, they say the Genesis has created kinds. It doesn't have from the bottom up things evolving, common descent. So, and by the way, Luke, I wanted to ask you a question. Your dad was a pastor, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you were a young earth creationist at one time?
Yeah.
What
yeah,
brought you out of young earth creationism?
Let me just finish off Phil's question.
Okay.
Just the other half of that was fine-tuning for our ability to understand the world. I think that's entirely correct. I think that's the case of I will call it just design rather than fine-tuning. I don't want to use the word fine-tuning as a synonym for design because it's not. But I think,
that makes sense.
That there is design there in our ability to think, I think is absolutely true. It's just a different argument. So that's all. It's good. That's just an issue about terminology. I should say Robin Collins has a argument that he's been working on for ages in a book that hopefully will come out at some point about fine-tuning for discoverability, which is using fine-tuning in that way. But the fact that not so much that we have the ability to discover the universe, but the universe has certain features that make it easier to discover things about than the sort of typical universe might have. Anyway, that's a bigger and a more interesting. It's sort of an interesting but harder to prove. But that's another idea.
Luke, to follow up with that, just to follow up with that, since you brought it up, this idea of man, I know you can answer this really quickly, and then we have another question from our field. Brandon Carter, Frank Tipler, or John Tipler and Barrow and Tipler. I keep forgetting their first names. So there's a slight difference between the weak and the strong anthropic principle. Carter had those 2 terms, and then Tipler and Barrow came along and wrote that the Bible on fine-tuning, if you will, the cosmological anthropic principle. Can you dissect in 60 seconds the difference between the current understanding of the strong and weak anthropic principle when it comes to fine-tuning?
Right. We're kind of stacking arguments here. So questions here. Let me just rewind a bit. Otherwise, I'm going to forget the question. So that was on the anthropic principle.
We can throw it out. We don't have to answer that. I
can answer that. I can answer that quickly. I'm just gonna answer. So just for the previous question, there's an article I wrote for Unbelievable the magazine. Hang on, let me see if I can find it and put it in the chat. So of how I sort of grew up, why I'm no longer. I'll put it in the chat if I can. Oh yeah, there we go. So I basically wrote this down in detail. It's not a very long story, but I might as well, rather than retelling the whole thing here. There's an article. I wrote it for Premier Christianity. That's the one. It's the people that unbelievable that they work for. So why I'm no longer a young Earth creationist. The short story is that I realized there were other ways to read Genesis, that it actually didn't tie you down. So I simply think the people from Answers in Genesis and the creation research, I just think they're wrong about what Genesis is trying to tell us. So that's the short story there. One of the other things was as I started my scientific training, I could evaluate young Earth creationist claims about science. And I found that an awful lot of those were just at best misrepresentations of the science. So a lot of that side of things, it's not that someone wrote a reply to this, which was why I am a young Earth creationist, and try to paint that, you're trusting science over the word of man. No, I finally learned, I was able to test the word of young Earth creationists against what scientists actually said, and found that the creationists were wrong just about what science said, let alone what it really
and here's the thing, Luke, they have a huge impact on the churches here in North America and Canada and Australia. If you go to Answers in Genesis, you go to the bookstore, and they still are going by Bishop Ussher's book that adds the date of the universe began 4004 BC on October 12th or whatever. So science has failed in America, that if you have 38% of Americans believing that the universe is 6,000 years old, you got a real problem. Don't you agree?
My impression is that it's weakening amongst Christians, but I'm not sure. So we might, within a couple of generations, see that change. But
well, hopefully, Luke, someone like yourself can help, because you are so articulate and knowledgeable in this area. And by the way, you do seem to be articulating a framework hypothesis of Genesis. Are you familiar with the framework?
Yeah, it's as far as I remember that, maybe roughly, yeah.
It never really caught on that big, but you have.
I don't want to sign up to anything too strongly.
Okay.
All right. Getting to the anthropic principle. So the way I would interpret the anthropic principle, so it's Brandon Carter, 1973. There's a paper he puts out which notes some of these fine-tuning cases and suggests the following principles to at least try to understand them. There's the weak anthropic principle, which I interpret as within a particular universe. So take the whole history of our universe. Where intelligent life turns up and when intelligent life turns up is very strongly constrained by the kind of thing that intelligent life is. So the fact that we turn up 10-ish billion years after the beginning, the fact that we turn up on the surface of a rocky planet is not, chance. We couldn't have turned up, 10 seconds after the beginning floating in space because there weren't any people then. So it's purely about when and where. He then has a strong anthropic principle which says, well, it'll also depend on the fundamental properties like these constants. But there's no deeper metaphysical principle there. It's purely a logical, an entailment that if you are in a universe and you are an intelligent observer, and if being a universe that is capable of producing intelligent observers requires certain constants to be in the right range, then obviously your constants will have to be in that range, purely as a matter of deduction, not as any sort of deeper metaphysical principle.
So is it safe to say the weak anthropic principle is a tautology in some sense, not just denigrate it, but the real simple is we're here because these things they have to be this way in order for us to be here. It's kind of an obvious statement, right? In that sense.
It shouldn't be controversial because it's just a selection effect, which is very common in science. If you want to know who's going to win the next election, and you get your clipboard out and just survey the first 100 people that you happen to meet, well, you might get the right answer. But if you accidentally found that you were standing outside of the Democratic National Convention, you're going to get a biased answer. You've just got to be careful about how you choose your sample. I think it's that sort of principle. The problem with those two principles that Carter said was, as you said, Barrow and Tipler, John Barrow and Frank Tipler, then came along and combined Carter's strong and weak principle into one principle and called it the weak principle, and then defined their own version of the strong principle, which just confused everybody. But I think Carter was right, so I think we should go with his terminology. Oh, Carter was most helpful. So.
Okay, we have a question from Sean. Sean, if you would unmute and ask your question, please.
Dr. Bournes, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. I've been following you for a while now, but it's a pleasure to finally to hear from you and hear you speak on the Zoom. And thank you all for the opportunity. It's always fun when I join you all's Zoom. Y'all do a great job. Although I think that's Mr. Beal there. He kind of gets me riled up sometimes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, my man.
I want to jump in. Like, I think we have similar personalities. My question is, I'm at the beginning of my career in philosophy, and I'm intimidated by the physics and the cosmology stuff, and the more abstract arguments, to me, they work better for me. But I want to learn, and I want to kind of understand eventually, when I feel I have good grasp of what's going on, to write on it. And so I want to understand just more physics generally. My problem is I think I'm kind of like a perfectionist. So I feel like before I speak, I have to understand every detail of the entire thing. And so, but I want to understand physics, and I want to understand what fine tuning is. And when I hear a lot of physicists and philosophers speak about fine tuning, it never seems to be very clear what they're talking about. Either I get that this is the impression I get, that there are a number of possibilities. But yeah, exactly. What is fine? So that's one of my areas that I want to study. What is fine tuning? What I want to get to, and I'm talking too much, but what I would like from you is like a beginner, intermediate, and advanced book suggestion list for just like physics in general, and like the particular disciplines, what they do in physics. Do you know anyone who's written like a extremely clear, but it has depth as well, book about that? And then in terms of fine tuning specifically.
Let me have a think. So, so Leonard Susskind has written a series of books called The Theoretical Minimum. And the idea is, there's courses as well. I thought they were just books. Interesting. So I've literally just Googled. I've read one of the books and looked through a couple of the other ones. It's called The Theoretical Minimum, What You Need to Know Before You Start Doing Physics. What you need to know to start doing physics, sorry. So there's one on just called The Theoretical Minimum, which is mostly about classical physics, and then one about quantum physics. Classical mechanics. There's a series of these, and they're pretty good. They're quite, so the question is, what can you do that's short of just doing a physics degree? And one of the issues is how much maths do you know? Or math, sorry. Just remembering my audience. Because if you can speak that language, then we're in business. And if you can't, then we're going to have to try and sort of do it conceptually, and that's a bit more difficult. But there's a good starting place. I think someone just put it in the chat, theoreticalminimum.com or something. In terms of just learning the physics, it's hard to know where to start, because, if you start with the classic physics courses, Newton's laws and thermodynamics and electromagnetism and classical fluids and waves. It's just, it takes a while to get around to the stuff that's relevant to fine tuning. It's all relevant, of course, in understanding what physics is. But I think theoretical minimum is a good place to start. In terms of the physics of fine tuning, it is really kind of all over the place. You have to pull together a whole bunch of stuff, which is why, as a theoretical physicist, it's so much fun for me. Obviously, we've tried to attempt to do that in the book, but there's also, there are other books on fine tuning, but I'm not entirely sure the level they're aimed at. The Book of the Cosmos, I'm seeing from Daniel there.
This is a good. It takes snippets of actual classical writings, and it goes from Heraclitus to Hawking, and talks about big discoveries in the universe, but it tells it in a common vernacular, so you get the story sort of behind the mathematics that comes from this. This was recommended to me by somebody that worked at the Space Telescope Science Institute. A great book.
Yeah, very
Sean
nice.
Carroll also has a book that just came out, The Biggest Ideas in the Universe, or something like that. It's a very compact layman's person's introduction to the big physics of the universe. And it's not an ideological book like some of his other ones necessarily. It's just, here's the basic big ideas in the universe right now. The biggest ideas in the universe, or something like that, but it's a relatively new book.
So, it's a question of how much maths it's a short story. Because if we've got to stick to popular level stuff, then that's one thing. If you can deal with taking the derivative of a function and an integral, maybe, then we can think about other ones. But I think anyway, those theoretical minimum books are very, very highly recommended. Another one which might be useful is, because at least I know the maths is fairly minimal. Tim Maudlin has a couple of books on the philosophy of physics, but actually that do quite a bit of physics in them. So there's one on space and time, and one of them on quantum theory. Yeah, just put Tim Maudlin. I'll put his name in the chat. To put Tim Maudlin into Amazon, and they'll turn up. Philosophy of physics, quantum theory, philosophy of physics, space and time. Those are quite good. In particular, philosophy of physics, space and time covers special relativity, so Einstein's special theory of relativity, in quite simple mathematics. There's nothing more complicated than a square root, but it's getting really, really a very nice approach to the foundations of that theory. I lectured on this a while ago, and I actually used Tim's approach to teach a second year university course on special relativity. And you could dress all those ideas up in more complicated math, but he really is getting down to the foundations of it. So that's another place to perhaps go.
I saw Greg just popped up a question. I don't know if Greg wants to come on and ask the question, or just we can read it for you.
I can talk. Yes. No, I just wanted to say thank you, Luke, for being on this this meeting here. I was actually at the meeting that Dan was at. I was there one time. They did have another Christian there, Dan. But they seem to be very open to other ideas. I'm more agnostic, but they seem to be open to more ideas than just their own. So, and one thing I will say, one of my favorite parts of the book was when you compared the question, who created God, to the cosmological argument as a supposed objection. You gave a great analogy, which actually, to me, I thought was a knockdown analogy. It shows how that question misunderstands the argument, because the idea is that God is necessary. And so you used a physics example to show that was not really a valid objection, because it misunderstands the whole point. If God's a necessary being, and that's you're positing that God is the reason for existence, then that doesn't make sense to say who created God. You answer the question, and your physical example was really good, but no one seems to understand when I tell it. Even at that meeting I was at, somebody who I told that argument to said, well, who created God, to Dan. So, but anyway, but my question really, sorry for that long introduction, but I just wanted to say, I really appreciate your book. In in your opening remarks, I work in science. I'm an anesthesiologist. I go to scientific meetings. No one ever uses the word prove in scientific meetings. I mean, maybe 1 or 2 times a year I ever hear that, but it's extremely rare. And so, and you say, you said that too. You don't prove things in science. It's not math. It's you actually come to the most probable likelihood of the explanations, right? And you compare different explanations of what's more likely, and then more evidence comes down and it changes the calculation. So when you look at the fine-tuning argument, I mean, how good of an argument do you think that is, looking in those terms? And maybe that's maybe I'm giving a loaded question because I'm using science to answer a question, scientific principles, but that's kind of how I look at things. Is this a good argument? Is this a knockdown argument? Is it a 100% argument? Although in science, it'll never be 100%. But I was just curious, how good an argument is the fine-tuning argument? I mean, we've talked about the brute fact explanation. Okay, well, we don't want to just stop at the brute fact, but what if that's the explanation? I mean, what's the percentage? Is it like 90%, God, 10% brute fact, or 50-50, 51-49? I mean, how do you look at that? And maybe I'm mischaracterizing the way you look at it totally. So feel free to object to the assumptions I have in my question.
So I think it's best thought of as a probabilistic argument. And the thing that really powers the argument is the thought, is there anything interesting or remarkable or noteworthy about this universe which might lead us to look for an explanation beyond itself? Just as with the deck of cards, if they're all in deck order, we don't just think that someone shuffled these. And what fine-tuning gives is a way of taking that rather large question and boiling it down to a process that we could say, all right, well, with the deck of cards, we have some sort of idea about what other ways the deck could be arranged. What other ways could the universe be arranged? Well, we've got these fundamental parameters. If we systematically change those numbers throughout the ranges that they're allowed to have, we'll get a handle on what could have been, and then we can look at our universe relative to those. And so I think if you're driving that way, if you sort of have that desire to know whether there's anything interesting or remarkable about this universe, if you really get that question, and if you take fine-tuning on as a way of addressing it, then what that sets up is that you realize that if you just take a brute fact approach, if you think the universe is all that there is, say naturalism is true or something like that, the just sort of probabilities as a Bayesian sense of probabilities, it's just let's try and understand our own ignorance probabilities. The probability of a life-permitting universe on naturalism is just extraordinarily small. And so the question then is, if you can give the God hypothesis any credit whatsoever, if you think it's impossible, then it's impossible, and nothing should change your mind about that. But if you think it's even vaguely possible and not ridiculously unlikely that there could be a God and God could create a universe that has, agents capable of morally meaningful lives in it, then because the probability of the alternative is so low, now we're in a really interesting area where suddenly, if you thought science explains everything and the universe is all explained and we're all good, or at least it will, then you'd have no reason to think about God. But suddenly if you see, oh, that's not enough, even when science has done everything it can do, they'll still have these questions like, why are the fundamental properties of nature the ones that allow for life? So it's not a problem with science. It's the success of science that points us to this problem. Then I think the fine-tuning argument should be quite compelling. Just because, you get to the problem with naturalism entirely in terms of naturalism itself, and at the deepest level, it's not higher level stuff like, we don't know what consciousness is. That's all really interesting and important, but that's a major mystery anyway. We're down right at the bottom level of physics. So if you can give God any credit whatsoever, I think at least you've lit a fire underneath the naturalist that something in here has got to change. This story can't be complete. And the way in which it's incomplete is a way in which a good creator could naturally step into that explanatory shortcoming that you see from naturalism. But so the objections I get are from naturalists are either, well, God's not on the table anyway. I can't even give God that much credit, so I don't care. Or maybe there's some naturalistic idea which will come along and save the day, like the multiverse. But even then, I think the multiverse, true or false, doesn't really address the issue here. So I think it's a good argument, but it does generate sort of every possible reaction to it.
Well, Luke, why is it that someone like Sean Carroll, who admits to these fine-tuning parameters, if you look at his thing, why God is not a good explanation, he admits these things are remarkable, especially the cosmological constant is just so unexpected. Why do you think, why isn't he just going, oh my gosh, this is just so clear, God's behind this? Why isn't that so?
Well, I mean, so I don't want to psychoanalyze. So I'll answer the question of what reason does he give? So the reason he gives is I think basically comes under that heading of God's not on the table. Or maybe to give it a little bit more credit than that, however much of a mystery fine-tuning creates, God is worse. God is more of a mystery. And I think that's what Richard Dawkins is getting at in the God delusion, although he doesn't put it particularly well. But his idea there, so he unfortunately says it in terms of God would be complex if there is a God. And then you've got something even more complex to explain than the universe itself. I don't think that's the way to think about it. But just the idea, so, God is not a good theory is one of Sean's talks. Just the idea that the thing to be the explanation has to sort of reduce the amount of mystery in the world, so to speak. So if I want to explain the cards being in deck order, according to, there are people who want cards to be in deck order because that's sort of the right and natural order that they come out of the factory. That explanation can't be, it has some level of plausibility to start with. It can't be less likely than the cards turning up in that order just by accident. Now, in that case, it's clearly that is the case. So that's why we think the cards came from the factory like that or whatever. I think for Sean, it's purely that he thinks that it doesn't help. But it's not that sort of God is ruled out as an assumption. It's just that it would increase the amount of mysteries we have to explain rather than decreasing it. Now, one of the reasons I think he thinks that is that he's comparing God to a scientific explanation. But what he really should be comparing God to is not a scientific explanation, but to naturalism itself, because those are the things that are competing to explain the universe at a fundamental level. So he says things like, we can't get predictions out of the idea that God exists, whereas a good scientific theory will give us predictions about how the world works. Any scientific theory you've got on naturalism, I can have on theism. That's not the right comparison. The question is whether you can get predictions out of naturalism, not whether you can get predictions out of a specific scientific theory. And this is what fine-tuning is supposed to show. The predictions you get out of naturalism are horrifically bad. They are the universe would be dead almost certainly. So I think that's the reason he gives, and that's my diagnosis for why I don't think it's a good reason. I think he's mixing up, he's substituting specific scientific theories and their ability to predict for naturalism's ability to predict, which are very different things.
Luke, we have a couple of questions from our audience. I think he's a new guest. Ken is somebody that I met, not Ken Daniels, but
yes,
Ken.
I'd like to go back first of all to the question of whether Genesis is supposed to be taken literally. I have a book here called The Genesis Enigma, and it's I don't have room under my desk to show this, but it says why the first book of the Bible is scientifically accurate. Okay, and here's the hypothesis. he says, well, take the order in which God created. I says, first he created the earth, then the plants, then the animals. And that's very true. I mean, it makes sense. First, you have to have the land for the animals to be on and the plants to grow on. And then he had the plants because you can't have the animals without food. So you have the plants and grasses after that. Then to come the animals. So it all makes sense. He says, you see, science will tell you the same thing. So I'll buy that. But I want to go back to the comment about science proving things. In the Middle Ages, there was a fellow named Otto von Guericke. And he said air has weight. People, of course, thought this man is crazy. How can air have weight? I hope you guys can understand me. I know I have a weird accent. But so he built these huge spheres with a valve on it. And he hitched it to two, I think it was like 4 horses on each side. I don't remember 2 or 4. And he vacuumed it, evacuated the air out of those huge metal spheres. And he had the horses pull, they couldn't take it apart. And then he went and just opened that valve and air came out and the thing fell apart. He said, you see, it is all because of the weight of the air on the spheres that the horses couldn't pull it apart. So there he proved something. We can't say science never proves anything. Some things will be like statistically probable more than others. That's one proof. And another one is also when I think it was Tycho Brahe or Kepler, when 1577 or something, a comet came through and it came between, or a meteorite between the earth and the moon. And the guy said, listen, this shows that there are no spheres around. You know how the idea of the planets moving on spheres? He smashed that. He proved that there are no crystal spheres. So there are things that science does prove. We can't say science never proves anything. Some things will probably be, nuanced and fine-tuned, like Newton's theory of gravity, and then come to Einstein's, which may be modified. But some things are proved in science. Thank you.
I think proved you're saying, I mean, observed.
Establish, okay.
Yeah. So proof in a mathematical sense is where you start from an axiom and then you derive it. So look, I don't want to get too much into the sort of just semantics of what words mean, but certainly I think the science where there are observations, yes, I mean, at some extent, there are observations you can't, where we can all agree at least on observables. That's to some level. One of the reasons why it doesn't quite so comets were known about to Aristotle, who said, there must be something happening in the upper atmosphere, right, which is not very convincing. But if it's possible, then you fall. The fact that you see comets and they seem to be going through what would be the crystalline spheres doesn't quite prove or disprove anything in particular. It's just a little bit awkward for his theory.
But it does prove that there are no crystal spheres. I mean, how otherwise you would have to smash the crystal sphere to come between the Earth and the Moon.
No, but you only have the appearance, right? It could be something in the upper atmosphere that just appears to be out in space where the crystal spheres are. That's what Aristotle said, very implausibly. So it falls short of a proof, that particular example. But there was a bright moving spot in the sky, something we could at least all agree on as long as we got eyes. So it's the observations we should be able to agree on, at least to a level that we can move on from there. Anyway, that's
so it's it's when we're talking about proof, it's something we all observe. We have agreed on the observation, but it eludes a 100% confirmation that there are no crystal spheres. Unlikely, but we haven't proven that they don't exist. That's kind of what you're saying in a sense. I mean, it seems like unlikely they do, but it's not a solid 100% proof. Tina, did you want to ask your question or?
Yes.
Yes. Go ahead.
So I typed a question in the chat, and then as I was thinking about it, I realized maybe I have 2 questions. The question that I put in the chat was, what is the most difficult argument that you have encountered against using the fine tuning of the universe argument for the existence of God? And then how do you respond to that? Really, this is coming from conversations I've had with my dad. And one of the things that he brings up is, well, you can't trust what you think you know about whatever it is that you're using to calculate the fine tuning probabilities and whatnot. There's just we are so small. The universe is so huge. Time is so, there's been so much time. How do you know how things were? And so he just basically dismisses the entire thing on a philosophical basis. So didn't know if you'd heard that argument before, how you would address it, and if there's an even better argument that maybe he might come across at some point that he will then pass along to me.
Yeah, just a straight up skepticism that we can know anything in this. It's funny how often people raise objections along the lines of, well, we can't really take the laws and predict what would happen as a result of them. And that's literally my job description. Like, I'm a theoretical astrophysicist. You're telling us none of us can do our jobs? Are you serious? I mean, there's more doubts than just that one, but it is kind of interesting whether that's a wholesale skepticism of science in general, or whether there's a very sort of scalpel comes out at just the right point to carve off the bits of science that don't imply fine tuning from the bits that do. It'd be interesting to try and sort of tease that out a bit. We're very small, but we have the cosmology is a remarkably successful science in terms of the predictions it can make about the world and the understanding it can make. It, regardless of the size, we really can make good predictions about the universe. I was talking to my students about this the other day. There's a really fascinating section in Augustine's book, The Confessions of St. Augustine, early 400s AD. Bishop in North Africa writes what's really the first autobiography that's actually honest about the person it's about, where it's about his struggles, not just trying to make himself sound great. At one point, he says, I'm paraphrasing, he says this much better, but I was in this cult called the Manichaeans who said all this stuff about the universe, and it all sounded really impressive and eloquent. And then I remembered that my classical education, that the Greeks, the philosophers, the Romans, Aristotle, Ptolemy, they can predict solar eclipses years in advance, and they get it right. And all these other philosophers, these Manichaeans, they went on and on and on and on and on and on and on about all this stuff, and they never predicted anything. So the predictions of science are kind of, there's an example 1,600 years ago, are a point that must stop you in your tracks to say, okay, we at least understand something about the world if we can get there ahead of time, at least some of the time. If that's true, these predictions precisely are the result of theoretical physics, that I can take some equations. If the universe was like this, in that case, it's Ptolemy's ideas. If the universe was, epicycles and all that, but still, if the universe was like this, then, I predict that the sun will go out during the day for a couple of minutes in a couple of years' time. And if you get that right, then there's something theoretical physics is doing that's got to be right. And so it's not that we are claiming to know everything. It's that, look, if you have this question about the world, that what's really going on under the surface, is there anything sort of design intuition worthy, anything that might lead us to think there's a deeper reason, a deeper purpose, a deeper design to what's going on around here? If you really properly want to know the answer to that question and don't want to just dismiss it, then having a method like fine tuning where theoretical physics can actually, it's not biased in terms of one outcome or another before it starts, and then it comes massively down in favor of design, that should be of interest to you. And if you, as a result of that, throw away the whole of theoretical physics, you've got to deal with the predictions that we get right. But if you think that if you take those predictions seriously, then you've got to take fine tuning seriously. I don't know if that's convincing to, someone who's looking for loopholes, perhaps. I don't want to psychoanalyze someone I don't know, but that's the line. If you want to throw away fine tuning, you've got to do such a delicate scalpel job, in physics, to just cut out just the right bit to get rid of fine tuning, but leave all the rest of the science that most people agree with. So I don't know.
I have a question for you. It might be off topic, but the James Webb Telescope, I was reading I think it was a Wall Street Journal. I can't remember where I read it now, but it was like some of the early data coming back about galaxy formations, and we're supposed to be seeing very close, less than a billion years from the Big Bang, and we're not seeing we're seeing fully developed, mature galaxies, and it seems like they're saying this is causing cosmologists to start to rethink or take a harder look if they're really seeing galaxies as that's what they're seeing. So can you comment on that? What's in your profession, what are people talking about?
Well, so it's not so much that it leads us to doubt cosmology, the overall expansion of the universe. What we're doubting, perhaps, with these very early galaxies is whether we really understand how galaxies form. And there's always been sort of uneasiness about the very early stages of that process in the early universe. And one of the reasons for that is the sun, we sort of roughly know what it's made of. Mostly hydrogen, some helium, and then other elements in the mix as well. And actually the main nuclear reaction process in the center of the star involves carbon and nitrogen and oxygen, the CNO cycle. That's relevant because in the very early of the universe, those elements don't exist yet. The first generation of stars that fire up must be purely what came out of the Big Bang, hydrogen and helium. And so they'll be quite different to stars we know of today. And the question of how then those stars evolve, what effect they have on the galaxies they're born in, is a bit of a major unknown, or at least there's not completely unknown, but a source of uncertainty there. So there's stuff about the universe we just don't understand yet. If we're finding out the galaxies form faster than we thought, then we're learning something about how galaxies form. We're not quite at the point where we've got to turn the whole story over yet. But this is, of course, we're going to have discovered stuff about the universe we didn't expect when you put a giant telescope in space. Like, that's exactly why we put it in space. It's what it's there for. We didn't want to just find out that we understood everything already.
Do we have anybody else, Dan?
I think
we've got about 5 minutes, by the way.
You are on a hot wire there to check out. So thanks for coming. Appreciate it.
We greatly appreciate you being here. Thanks so much.
Is it too late to interject?
Go ahead.
Another observation. So I kind of indicated I was impressed with the idea of fine tuning. A really great book. I didn't want to shortchange my skeptical position. I want to offer one reason why I'm open to the idea that the multiverse explains fine tuning. And that is that before the 1990s, we didn't have any direct observational evidence of extrasolar planets in our galaxy. But cosmologists surmise that they must exist because, hey, otherwise, if the Earth was the only planet in the entire universe, what are the odds that it would be suitable for life, right? So they surmise that there must be other planets around other suns, and we just happen to be on one that is suitable for life. So anytime that, in our experience, if I'm walking along a beach and I see a coconut on the beach, I can surmise there's probably other coconuts, in existence, even if I've never seen a coconut before in my life, or if I see a unicorn, it's likely that there's another example of that somewhere, that it's not just standing alone, right? So there's a philosophical kind of a impetus for us to think that, there's multiple planets and around other suns. Otherwise, there's no explanation why we would be special as the Earth. So by analogy, you could say, well, if we find ourselves in a universe that seems fine-tuned for life, we're perhaps in the same position as we were before the 1990s. We had no direct observational evidence of other planets around other suns, but using the same logic, we could make not a proof, but it kind of an assumption that there's probably other universes out there with different kinds of parameters that exist, and we just happen to be the one that is suitable for life. So that's kind of my reasoning for going towards more Garrett's position on that matter.
Can I ask
Interesting
Mr.
argument.
Barnes a question?
Oh, well, Luke's got to wrap up. He's on a tight schedule. So let him kind of fill in what Ken has to say, and then he's going to have to bid us adieu.
Okay,
Yeah,
I don't have
let's-
anything to say.
Go
I heard something today that I was in the car and I didn't catch it. They were talking about a black hole that's about 1 million times the mass of the sun and streaming across with a mile that's like this. I think they said 20 light years long or 200 light years long. And in that stream, in the tail, it's got a long tail, and in the tail, stars are being created. And apparently it was some new discovery, and I'm wondering if you heard about it. I tried to find it on the internet. I couldn't find it. Did you hear anything about that?
We know that black holes have jets. If you look up black
Yeah.
hole jets, largest known on the sky, you'll get an article by me in the conversation about one that we found. So go look that up. Very quickly,
I know,
in the last-
I know about those, but this seemed like it was
Yeah,
something.
Luke has to go. I'm sorry to cut you up. Luke has to
Yeah.
go.
Thank
And
you,
So he's
thank you.
I got 2 minutes.
Appreciate
That,
it.
that multiverse objection is really interesting, that when we see something, we automatically assume there's more of them. More universes isn't quite enough for a multiverse, right? You actually need, right? So more of the same electron is just more fine-tuned electrons. What you need is different electrons that have different properties. You don't just need, if I have a lottery ticket, having more of the same ticket isn't going to help me win the lottery. I need different tickets. So there's a little bit more going on there than that. But if you want to look up a paper of mine, it's called A Reasonable Little Question, has got an objection to the sort of a reply to the multiverse there. It's just look up a philosophical paper of mine in a journal called Ergo. There's only one I've written there. So if you find that, that's all good. All right. I have to leave. One of my
Thank you.
students.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
I've got to go. Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate you.
A pleasure.
Let me take a moment, everyone, to talk about our next book club. It's going to come up quick, and we need to be ready and have our homework done for that. So we're going to be May the 4th be with you. We're going to do a Star Wars book club on May 4th, Thursday, May 4th, same time, same channel. But that's just coming up in a few days here. But we do have a great guest author. We've had him once before. Graham Oppy is also an Australian philosopher whose main area of research is the philosophy of religion. He's atheist. He holds the post of professor of philosophy and associate dean of research at Monash University. He serves on the editorial boards of Philo, Philosopher's Compass, Religious Studies, and Sophia. He was elected fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities back in 2009. And we're going to be looking at his book, Atheism, the Basics, and then we're going to have him on. And let me say, this is a guy, one of the leading atheist philosophers in the whole, especially if you narrow it down to philosophy of religion. William Lane Craig said this guy is scary smart. He was at our book club a year and a half ago, maybe, along with Tim McGrew, and they both took chapters of a book that they collaborated on. And it was one of our best book clubs ever, I think. And he's going to be back and joining us. So grab the book, Atheism, the Basics by Graham Oppy. Any questions on that?
It's a short book. It's a short book. So it's,
Well, I'm
it's,
sorry. Would you repeat the name of the book again, please?
Atheism, the Basics
Oh,
by
yeah.
Graham Oppy with 2 P's. It's
Okay.
a short paperback book.
Okay, thank you.
When is that next meeting?
May the 4th
May the
be
4th.
with you.
May the 4th. Okay. Sorry, I checked out during the whole Force be with you. My mind started wandering, and I had Darth Vader came into my view and everything like that, and then I forgot the whole Yeah.
It's a Mandalorian event that we're doing on this one. Okay. Yes. Hey, great book club. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Who do we have that's new? Let me put it on my view where I can see everybody for just a second here.
I was new, I guess.
Okay, raise your hand if you're new.
Yes. Welcome. Hello, Ken.
Welcome.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, Dan.
Good name,
Welcome,
Ken.
Ken.
All right.
I'm sorry I was late. I totally forgot about it, and all of a sudden it hit me. I said, "Oh, I better join."
That's okay. Glad to have you on board. Yeah, it was great to have you.
But
So glad to have you guys
if
on.
anybody's interested, that story about Otto von Guericke, he was a German guy, and I remember that from I guess I must have been 12 years old or something in my science book. I still remember that event, proving that air has weight with that huge metal spheres. And that's what convinced me about science being, something interesting.
How did you hear about how did you hear about the book club, Ken?
Which book club? This one?
This one.
Oh yeah, because Dan was at our book club meeting last time.
You were at
Ken's-
the other book club. Okay, great.
Right.
Right. That's where I met
That's-
Ken and I.
Yes, that is, and yes, Bill is there, and Greg, where's Greg?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Yeah,
I would just say that every scientific experiment has assumptions, and that's why I don't use the word proof. There's always
Well-
assumptions, and you're assuming that it could happen every time too. I mean, universality.
No, I didn't say that. I said
No.
sometimes.
That's what was done. So that's why I don't use the word proof. Proof to me is mathematics. 1 + 1 = 2.
Okay, if you want to define
But
it,
that's why. And in scientific meetings that I go to, they just don't use that word. That's what my point was. So I was agreeing with Luke. We don't use that word when we write scientific papers. We don't use that word proof.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's
all. That's all I'm saying. High degree of probability. That's absolutely. I'm all for that. I'm all for science telling us things. Absolutely.
That's fine.
Just a
That is why I
FYI.
corrected myself. I said established. He established. Okay.
Just a FYI, Bill Cluck and I are going to be in Tallahassee next week, a week from today, actually, and at the Evangelical Missions to Non-Christian Religions Conference. And we're doing a dialogue, atheist and Christian in conversation. And so those of you who are Christian, pray for us. And those who are not, maybe wish us good luck on that. And we'll hopefully come back with a report.
You got a lot of ammo from Luke for the discussion of does God exist, right?
Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you so enjoy putting people on the spot, Bill. So it makes me not feel too bad about it. So was there anything in the book when you read it that you, as an atheist, you're saying, okay, I find this really hard to deal with. I'm just going to put it on the shelf for now. Or if I don't get an answer to this in the next 30 days, I'm out of here. I mean, tell us what you're feeling as you're reading it.
No, absolutely zero. It really had nothing to say. No good arguments. Just, pretty pathetic, to be honest with you. No, obviously, I told it first. It was some really interesting things. I really can identify with Ken that, the fine tuning has some remarkable things about it. And I'm struggling to read the book. And I've been looking at the YouTube things between Sabina and Luke, and Sabina in general, who Ken turned me on to her, who she is amazing. She has such really good arguments, and she's an atheist, by the way. But then again, Luke has some. So you don't have to have all the answers. These things are, like Luke was saying, are terribly complex, terribly difficult. The cosmologists don't really understand a lot of this stuff about dark matter and dark energy. So it's okay to have the tension. Live with the tension.
Okay. Well, I want to thank everybody for being a part of the club. Look forward to seeing you guys next week. Don't forget, or in a little bit more than a week, on May the 4th. So what we want to do is remind you that we do have the atheistchristianbookclub.com, where we have most of several years worth of previous book club videos that you can watch and kind of get an idea of what's going on. We also have the Facebook page and the Friends of the Atheist and Christian Book Club Facebook group, which you can ask questions, continue the dialogue. Some real good text, things that we didn't get to. We got to most of them, but we can continue these discussions in the Friends of the Atheist and Christian Book Club group on Facebook. And I did want to say, I didn't say it at the beginning of the club, but this is a respectful conversation. I think everybody noticed that today. We don't try to get into the arguments or the ad hominem attacks or things like that. I will say that when we switched over to being on Zoom and we weren't meeting in person, having a meal together, having these discussions, that I was worried that that would go away. It hasn't, but it was pointed out to me, and I did check in on it a little bit. We have had some book clubs that the conversation in the text has not been as generous as the conversations in the club itself. So let's try to keep that clean too, and make this a respectful dialogue. And as time goes on, I have personally developed some pretty good friendships here in the club, and I'm thankful for everybody on both sides, Christians and atheists, that give their time to read the books and be in the group. So let's do everything that we can to keep it like it is, to keep it respectful, and to deal with the hard questions, and to do so with integrity. Thanks so much, and we will see you on May 4th.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.